The Carter household was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like it precedes a storm. James Carter sat at the edge of the dining room table, the same table where birthdays were celebrated and family dinners were shared. But now, it felt foreign, a battleground of conflicting emotions. The table's polished surface reflected the glossy pages of the DNA test results spread before him. Each word on the page screamed truths he was not ready to confront, and the silence of the room made those truths deafening. James's heart pounded as he read the lines again, his eyes lingering on the brutal finality of the conclusion: likelihood of paternity, 0%. He swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the words. 2 weeks ago, this thought wouldn't have even crossed his mind. He'd been a proud father to Ethan and Liam, twin boys who embodied everything he held dear in life. Their shared movie nights, baseball games, and camping trips all felt like sacred memories. But now, with just a few sheets of paper, those moments felt like they belonged to someone else. It had started innocently enough. Ethan, always curious and full of questions, had come home from school one afternoon with a genealogy kit his teacher handed out for an extracurricular project. "It's to help us trace our roots, Dad," he'd exclaimed with the kind of excitement that only a 12-year-old could muster. James had chuckled, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Sure, let's find out where the Carter stubborn streak comes from," he'd joked. Ethan and Liam had eagerly sent off their samples, and James hadn't thought much more about it. Weeks later, when the results arrived, Ethan was ecstatic. "Dad, we have African roots," he had shouted, waving the printed pages around. James had laughed at first, assuming there had been some mix-up. But when he read the results himself, unease settled in his chest. Carter ancestry, as far back as he could remember, was steeped in Irish and Scandinavian heritage. Jessica's family, too, was rooted in English and German origins. The presence of African genes didn't align, and James found himself asking questions he never thought he'd ask. He remembered Jessica's reaction when he showed her the results. She'd barely looked at them, brushing it off with an airy laugh. "You know these tests aren't reliable," she had said, avoiding his gaze as she busied herself in the kitchen. Ethan probably switched his sample with a friend as a joke. Her explanation had been plausible enough to stop James from pursuing the matter, at least for a while. But as the days passed, his mind kept circling back to her words, to the nervous laugh that didn't quite sound like her usual carefree tone, and the way she had avoided making eye contact. Something was off, and deep down, he knew it. That gnawing doubt had led him to take matters into his own hands. Without telling Jessica, James purchased a second DNA kit, this time for himself and the boys. He collected their samples while they were asleep, feeling a pang of guilt as he swabbed their mouths. "I'm doing this for them," he told himself. "For their future." He sent off the samples and waited, each passing day amplifying the unease in his chest. And now, here he was, staring at the results that confirmed his worst fear. Neither Ethan nor Liam shared his DNA. They weren't his biological sons. James's thoughts turned to Jessica, his wife of 14 years. She had been his rock, the person who knew him better than anyone else. He had trusted her with his dreams, his vulnerabilities, his life. But now, that trust felt shattered. Pieces of their life together replayed in his mind with new, sinister undertones: the late-night work meetings, the sudden interest in fitness and dieting, the cryptic messages on her phone that she always kept face down. Each memory was a puzzle piece, and the picture they formed was one of betrayal. Then there was Mark Wilson, Jessica's boss at the law firm where she had worked for the past decade. Mark was everything James wasn't: tall, charismatic, and exuding a self-assured charm that seemed to command every room he entered. James had always felt slightly uncomfortable around him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Mark had a way of lingering in conversations with Jessica at office parties, his hand resting on her shoulder just a second too long, his laugh a touch too intimate. James had written it off as professional camaraderie, until now. As James pieced together the timeline in his head, the picture became clearer. Jessica had started working overtime around the time the boys were conceived. The African ancestry in Ethan and Liam's DNA pointed to Mark, whose Nigerian heritage he proudly showcased during company diversity events. James's stomach churned at the thought. Could it really be that his wife had been carrying on a secret affair with her boss for over a decade? The sound of laughter snapped James out of his thoughts. Ethan and Liam were playing in the backyard, their laughter carrying through the open window. He looked at them, Ethan's scrunched nose as he teased his brother, Liam's energetic gestures as he tried to explain the rules of their made-up game. They were his boys. They had his mannerisms, his humor, his love of adventure. How could a piece of paper tell him they weren't? James felt a surge of anger, not at the boys, but at Jessica. If she had betrayed him, she had also betrayed them. They deserved to know the truth, to understand where they came from. But how could he tell them without breaking their hearts? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Jessica walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked surprised to see James sitting at the dining table, the DNA test results in plain view. "What's all this?" she asked, setting her purse down. James didn't answer immediately. He studied her face, searching for any flicker of guilt or recognition. "Sit down," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. Jessica hesitated, then took a seat across from him. Her eyes flicked to the papers on the table, and for a brief moment, James thought he saw a flash of panic. "I had a DNA test done," he said, his voice even. "On Ethan and Liam." Jessica's face froze, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Because something didn't add up," James replied. He pushed the papers toward her. "And now I know why." Jessica's hands trembled as she picked up the results. Her eyes darted across the page, and James watched as the color drained from her face. "James, I can explain," she began, her voice shaking. "Explain what?" he asked, his tone sharp. "That you've been lying to me for over a decade? That you let me believe Ethan and Liam were mine when you knew the truth?" Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, but James felt no sympathy. He had cried enough for both of them over the past few days. "Was it Mark?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Is he their father?" Jessica didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. The weight of her betrayal crushed down on James, but beneath the anger and pain, a new resolve began to form. This wasn't just about him. This was about the family he thought he had, the life he thought they had built together. And no matter how much it hurt, James was determined to uncover the full truth, even if it meant tearing apart the facade Jessica had worked so hard to maintain. Jessica sat frozen, the weight of James's words pressing down on her like an avalanche. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the muffled laughter of Ethan and Liam playing in the backyard. The sound was cruelly juxtaposed against the tension that threatened to consume the room. James's eyes bore into her, searching for some glimmer of humanity in a woman he now barely recognized. "Was it Mark?" he asked again, his voice sharper, more insistent. Jessica's hand trembled as she reached for the glass of water on the table, buying herself precious seconds. "James, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Can we just talk about this? Calmly. Calmly." James barked, shoving the DNA test results closer to her. The force made the glass wobble dangerously on the table. "You've had years to calmly tell me the truth. I deserve answers, Jessica, now." Jessica's composure broke like a dam giving way. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she murmured. James leaned forward, his knuckles widening as he gripped the edge of the table. "What way, Jessica? What were you planning? To take this secret to your grave? To let me spend my life raising someone else's kids while you—" "What?" He paused, his voice dropping into something dangerously quiet. "Played house with your boss." Jessica's head snapped up at that. "It wasn't like that," she said defensively, her voice trembling but desperate. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." James interrupted, his voice thunderous. "Help me understand how the woman I loved, the mother of my children, could lie to my face for over a decade." Jessica recoiled, her body curling inward as if shielding herself from the force of his words. She inhaled sharply, as if bracing herself for a confession she had dreaded for years. "Yes," she finally admitted, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "Mark is their father." The words hung in the air, a lethal weapon aimed directly at James's heart. He felt as if the room had dropped 10 degrees, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he tried to process the enormity of her betrayal. His worst suspicions were confirmed, and yet, hearing the truth made it so much worse. "How long?" he asked after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica hesitated, her lips trembling. 10 years, she said finally. "It started shortly after I joined the firm." James laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. 10 years, he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "You carried this on for 10 years, and yet you came home to me every night, pretended to love me, and built this life, all while living a lie." Jessica flinched at his words. "I did love you, James. I still do." "Don't," James snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare say that to me. Love doesn't look like this, Jessica. Love doesn't involve lies, affairs, and children that aren't mine." Jessica broke down, her sobs racking her body. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she pleaded. "Mark, he was charming and persuasive, and I was stupid. It was just supposed to be a fling, something meaningless. But then I got pregnant. And you decided to make me your fool," James said coldly, his anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "You saw me as nothing more than a convenient safety net." "No," Jessica protested. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but I didn't know how. And then Ethan and Liam were born, and I saw the way you looked at them, the way you loved them. I thought maybe it didn't matter. You were their father in every way that counted." "In every way but the one that actually matters," James countered, his voice sharp as glass. "Their DNA doesn't lie, Jessica. You do." The word struck Jessica like a physical blow, and for a moment, she was speechless. Finally, she whispered, "What are you going to do?" James let out a long, slow breath. "What I should have done a long time ago," he said. "You're going to tell the boys the truth." "No," Jessica said, her voice panicked. "James, please. They're too young to understand. It'll destroy them. They deserve to know who they are, Jessica. And they deserve to know who you are." Before Jessica could respond, the sound of the back door opening interrupted them. Ethan and Liam bounded into the room, their faces flushed from playing outside. "Dad, can we have ice cream?" Ethan asked, his grin wide and full of innocence. James's heart clenched at the sight of them. No matter what the DNA test said, they were his boys in every way that mattered to him. He would protect them from this storm for as long as he could. "Sure," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Why don't you guys go clean up first?" The boys whooped with excitement and raced upstairs, their footsteps thundering on the stairs. James turned back to Jessica, his expression hardening. "You have until tomorrow to figure out how you're going to tell them. Because if you don't, I will." Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but the fire in James's eyes silenced her. She knew she had no choice. The night passed in agonizing silence. Jessica retreated to their bedroom, her sobs muffled by the walls. James stayed downstairs, staring at the DNA test results until the lines blurred together. His mind raced with questions he didn't have answers to. How had their marriage come to this? What would the boys think of him if they knew the truth? And, most haunting of all, how could he move forward when the life he thought he had was built on lies? But amid the chaos in his heart, one thought stood out above the rest. He needed to confront Mark Wilson. This wasn't just about Jessica anymore. Mark had played a role in this betrayal, and James wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. As dawn broke, casting pale light across the room, James stood, a newfound resolve hardening his features. The storm was far from over, but he was ready to face it head-on. The sunlight that streamed into James's living room the next morning seemed cruel, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in his heart. He sat on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his phone in one hand and the DNA test results in the other. The morning was quiet except for the muffled sounds of Ethan and Liam upstairs. Jessica had barely spoken to him since their confrontation, retreating into the bedroom like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. James's thumb hovered over Mark Wilson's contact information on his phone. The thought of calling him, a man he had once thought of as nothing more than Jessica's boss, made James's blood boil. How easy it had been for Mark to weave himself into the fabric of James's family, to take what wasn't his, to rewrite James's life without permission. He set the phone down and stood, the chair groaning under the sudden movement. His heart pounded as he made his way to the kitchen. The coffee pot hissed as it brewed the morning's first cup, but the bitterness in the air didn't come from the coffee. James's mind raced, thoughts colliding in a maelstrom of anger, betrayal, and confusion. A decade of deceit couldn't be undone in one night, but James knew he couldn't afford to dwell in his pain. Action was the only thing that could restore some semblance of control. He heard the boys' laughter upstairs and closed his eyes, leaning against the counter. Ethan and Liam didn't deserve to be caught in this web. Whatever happened next, James resolved to shield them from the worst of it. They were innocent, and no revelation about their biological father could change what he felt for them. But Mark Wilson. He was the shadow hanging over James's life, the architect of this chaos. He was the one who had planted himself in Jessica's life, exploiting the cracks in their marriage. He had to answer for it. By the time Jessica emerged from the bedroom, James had already showered, dressed, and eaten breakfast with the boys. Jessica looked pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She glanced at him, a tentative expression on her face, but James didn't return the look. "I'm taking the boys to the park," he said, his tone curt. "You should use the time to figure out how you're going to tell them." "James, please," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "Can't we wait? They're just kids. They won't understand." "They'll understand the truth," James interrupted, his voice hard. "And I'm done pretending for your sake." Jessica flinched but said nothing more. As James gathered Ethan and Liam, he avoided her eyes. He couldn't let her see how deeply her betrayal had shaken him. Not yet. She'd see soon enough. The office building where Jessica worked was all glass and steel, its modern facade glittering in the midday sun. James had driven there without hesitation after dropping the boys off at his sister's house, the DNA test results tucked neatly into his jacket pocket. He parked across the street, staring up at the imposing structure. This was where Mark Wilson worked. This was where the truth began. James took a deep breath and exited the car. His steps were measured, purposeful, as he crossed the street and entered the lobby. The receptionist at the front desk greeted him with a polite smile, her manicured fingers poised over the keyboard. "Good morning, sir. Do you have an appointment?" James forced a smile, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "No, but I'd like to see Mark Wilson. It's a personal matter." The receptionist's smile faltered. "Mr. Wilson is in a meeting right now. If you'd like, I can." "Tell him James Carter is here," James said, his voice firm. "I'll wait." The receptionist hesitated but nodded, picking up the phone. James crossed to the waiting area, his pulse pounding as he sat down. The sleek leather chairs and modern decor felt out of place, a backdrop for the confrontation he was about to unleash. Minutes later, a door down the hall opened, and Mark Wilson stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his tailored suit impeccably pressed. His confident stride and easy smile spoke of a man accustomed to being in control. But when his eyes met James's, the smile faltered. "James," Mark said, his voice smooth but guarded. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" James stood, his posture tense. "We need to talk." Mark glanced around, his smile returning but now tinged with discomfort. "Of course. Let's step into my office." The office was as meticulously designed as the man himself, polished wood, tasteful artwork, and a panoramic view of the city. James closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate. "So," Mark began, leaning casually against his desk. "What brings you here?" James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded DNA test results. He tossed them onto the desk, the pages fluttering slightly before settling in front of Mark. "This," James said simply. Mark's expression shifted as he picked up the papers, his brows furrowing as he read. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mark sighed, setting the papers down. "I see," he said, his tone measured. "I suppose Jessica told you." James's jaw tightened. "She confirmed what I already suspected. But that doesn't excuse what you did." Mark raised his hands in a placating gesture. Look, I'm not going to deny what happened. It was wrong. I know that. But Jessica and I. Don't, James snapped, cutting him off. Don't try to justify it. You knew she was married. You knew she had a family. And you still went after her. Mark's calm demeanor wavered. It wasn't like that, James. It wasn't planned. We got close working together, and one thing led to another. Save it, James said, his voice cold. You think this is some excuse to explain away the fact that you've been a part of my life for 10 years without me knowing? You think you can just brush this off like it's nothing? Mark straightened, his expression hardening. I'm not brushing it off. I take full responsibility for my actions. But this isn't just about me, James. It's about Jessica, too. James's eyes blazed. You don't get to put this on her alone. You're both guilty. But unlike her, you're not part of this family. You never were, and you never will be. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but James held up a hand, silencing him. I'm not here to listen to your excuses. I'm here to make one thing clear. You're going to stay away from my family. You're not going to contact Jessica, and you're not going to go anywhere near Ethan and Liam. Do you understand me? Mark's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I understand. James leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it. With that, James turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. He didn't look back. As James stepped out into the sunlight, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming control of his life, and for now, that was enough. James Carter drove home in a daze, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The confrontation with Mark Wilson had left him drained but resolute. There had been no shouting, no punches thrown, just the cold, cutting truth and the warning James delivered with unwavering precision. Mark's guarded apology and feeble attempts to rationalize his betrayal had only fueled James's determination. But now, as the familiar streets of his neighborhood came into view, James felt a sense of dread creeping in. He had faced Mark, but the battle inside his home was far from over. Jessica was still there, likely pacing, crafting another web of explanations and pleas. And the boys, Ethan and Liam, were blissfully unaware of the storm about to rip through their lives. James parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. The sun cast long shadows across the front yard, the swing set standing still in the afternoon calm. He could hear the faint sound of children laughing down the street, a reminder of the innocence he was about to shatter. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the front door, his resolve firm. Jessica was waiting in the living room when he entered. She looked smaller than he remembered, curled up on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. For a fleeting moment, James felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly swallowed by the memory of her betrayal. "Where are the boys?" he asked, his voice flat. "They're still at your sister's," Jessica replied quietly. "I thought it would be better if we had this conversation alone." James nodded and set his keys on the table. The house felt oppressive, the walls closing in on them as the silence stretched. Finally, Jessica broke it. "Did you see him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I did," James replied, crossing his arms. "And I told him to stay away from you. From all of us." Jessica's shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "James, Don't," James interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't try to explain it again. I've heard enough of your excuses." Jessica flinched, but James pressed on, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You made your choices, Jessica. You chose to betray me, to lie to me, and to bring someone else's children into our marriage. You don't get to play the victim now." Tears streamed down Jessica's face, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at her hands, twisting the hem of her sweater nervously. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. James exhaled slowly, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "I don't know," he admitted. "But the boys deserve the truth. They need to know who they are, where they come from." Jessica shook her head frantically. James, please, don't do this to them. They're just kids. They won't understand. They'll understand more than you think, James replied. And they deserve better than this, better than lies and secrets. If we don't tell them now, it'll only hurt them more later. Jessica buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. James turned away, unable to watch her crumble under the weight of her own choices. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stared out the window at the backyard where Ethan and Liam often played. They love you, Jessica said behind him, her voice hoarse. No matter what the DNA says, they see you as their dad. That's all that should matter. James closed his eyes, his grip tightening around the glass. I love them too, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But love doesn't erase the truth. It doesn't make this right. The next morning, James woke early, the weight of the previous day still pressing heavily on his chest. He showered, dressed, and left the house without saying a word to Jessica. She watched him go from the window, her expression a mixture of fear and sadness. James drove to his sister's house, determined to talk to Ethan and Liam. He had rehearsed the conversation in his head 100 times, but no amount of preparation could make it easier. The boys greeted him with bright smiles and tight hugs when he arrived, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing in their family. Hey, guys, James said, ruffling Ethan's hair. How about we take a drive? Just the three of us. The boys were excited at the prospect, chattering animatedly as they climbed into the car. James drove aimlessly for a while, listening to their laughter and banter. Finally, he pulled into a quiet park, parking the car under the shade of a large oak tree. Can we play on the swings? Liam asked, already unbuckling his seatbelt. Not yet, James said gently. There's something I need to talk to you about first. The boys exchanged curious glances but settled back in their seats, their attention fixed on their father. James took a deep breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Ethan, Liam, he began, his voice steady but soft. I want you to know that I love you. More than anything in this world. That will never change. The boys frowned, sensing the seriousness in his tone. We love you too, Dad, Ethan said. What's wrong? James hesitated, his heart pounding. There's something I need to tell you. Something about your mom and me. He paused, searching for the right words. You know how sometimes families have secrets. Things that they don't talk about because they're hard to explain. The boys nodded slowly, their expressions solemn. Well, this is one of those times, James continued. You know how much I love being your dad, right? How proud I am of both of you. Yeah, Liam said quietly. You always say that. James smiled faintly. That's because it's true. But there's something else you need to know. Something important. He took another deep breath, the words catching in his throat. I found out recently that I'm not your biological father. The boys stared at him, their young faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. What do you mean? Ethan asked, his voice small. It means that someone else is your biological dad, James said gently. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm your dad in every way that matters. I've been here for you since the day you were born, and I always will be. Tears welled up in Liam's eyes. Who's our real dad? He asked. James hesitated, the name on his lips like poison. His name is Mark Wilson. He's someone your mom used to work with. The boys were silent, their faces pale and unreadable. James reached out, pulling them into a hug. I know this is a lot to take in, he said softly. But I need you to know that I love you, no matter what. You'll always be my sons. The days that followed James's confession to Ethan and Liam were quiet but heavy with unspoken emotions. The boys had been subdued, their usual energy replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Jessica stayed in the house, her presence ghost-like, drifting from room to room with an air of defeat. James focused on the boys, doing his best to maintain some semblance of normalcy while the truth continued to unravel their lives. James knew he couldn't shield them from everything. The cracks were too deep, and the damage too widespread. What mattered now was ensuring that the pieces were put back together with integrity, no matter how painful the process. One evening, as James tucked Ethan and Liam into bed, Ethan looked up at him, his young face etched with confusion. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "does this mean you're not going to be our dad anymore?" James's heart broke all over again. He crouched beside the bed, taking Ethan's hand in his. "No, buddy," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'll always be your dad. Nothing will ever change that. I was there the day you were born, I've been there every day since, and I'll be there for you every day to come. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded, though his eyes were still clouded with doubt. Liam, lying in the other bed, whispered, "We love you, Dad." James reached out and ruffled Liam's hair. "I love you both more than anything in the world. You're my boys, and that's all that matters." The boys seemed reassured, but James couldn't shake the weight in his chest as he left their room. The truth had created a fracture in their family that would never fully heal. But as he walked back to the living room, he resolved that whatever came next, his sons would never question his love or commitment to them. Jessica was sitting on the couch when he returned, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up at him as he entered, her expression a mixture of guilt and desperation. "James," she began softly, "can we talk?" He sighed, sitting down in the chair across from her. "What is there to talk about, Jessica? The damage is done." Jessica flinched but pressed on. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't undo," she said, her voice trembling. "But I want to fix this. I want to fix us." James stared at her, the woman he had once loved so deeply now feeling like a stranger. "Fix us," he repeated, his tone incredulous. "How do you fix a marriage built on lies, Jessica? How do you rebuild trust when it's been shattered?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm willing to try. I'll do whatever it takes." James shook his head, his jaw tight. "This isn't just about us. It's about Ethan and Liam. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed them. And they're the ones who are going to carry this for the rest of their lives." Jessica's tears fell freely now, but James felt no satisfaction in her pain. He stood, his decision clear in his mind. "This marriage is over, Jessica," he said quietly but firmly. "I can't live like this, pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I'll always be there for the boys, but you and I, we're done." Jessica sobbed, her hands covering her face, but James felt no urge to comfort her. He turned and walked to the door, grabbing his jacket. "Where are you going?" Jessica choked out. "For a drive," he said without looking back. "I need some air." The night air was crisp as James drove aimlessly through the city, his mind racing. The confrontation with Jessica had felt final, but it hadn't brought him the closure he'd hoped for. The betrayal still weighed heavily on him, a wound that refused to close. He found himself pulling into the parking lot of a small diner on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, almost deserted, the kind of spot where people went to escape. James stepped inside, the warm glow of the neon lights a stark contrast to the cold night outside. As he sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jessica. "I'm sorry, James. For everything. I hope one day you can forgive me." James stared at the message for a long moment before putting the phone down. Forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb, but maybe, one day, for the sake of the boys, he could find a way. As he sat there, lost in thought, he realized that the road ahead would be difficult, but it wasn't insurmountable. He had Ethan and Liam, and that was all that mattered. They were his anchor, his reason to keep going. The betrayal had broken something inside him, but it hadn't destroyed him. He would rebuild his life piece by piece, for his sons and for himself. And as he walked out of the diner into the cool night air, he felt a flicker of hope, a small but steady light guiding him forward. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. One where the truth, no matter how painful, would be the foundation of everything he built.